Michael, we're so happy to have you as our guest today. We are talking about how in this diverse and increasingly divided society, how and who and why we want to remember. We are going to talk about how a multidirectional memory can look like, and hopefully it can help us to move closer again, build solidarity, and to refuse to play collective traumas off against each other. What can we learn from thinkers such as Du Bois, Aimé Césaire, Frantz Fanon, and Hannah Arendt?
One is that all four of these figures, in their different ways, bring together and relate violence that takes place outside of Europe and violence that takes place inside Europe. In Arendt, in Origins of Totalitarianism, she has this notion of the boomerang effect, the way that certain racialized practices that were developed in the colonies have returned to Europe in the period of National Socialism, right, in terms of fascism. I think if we think today about migrant deaths in the Mediterranean, for example, or what's happening in Israel, Palestine, in the Middle East more broadly, I think you can't avoid thinking about the way that what happens in Europe and what happens outside of Europe is connected in powerful and very disturbing ways often, right? Not identical, but somehow related. The other question that's been much debated in Germany and now increasingly in other places as well over the last year is the relationship between anti-Semitism and racism. And I think all four of these thinkers give us ways of thinking those things together. I would not say that they collapse them into each other. For example, in this piece by Du Bois that I write about, which was one of the origins of multidirectional memory, The Negro and the Warsaw Ghetto is the name of the essay he wrote, he makes it very clear that he's distinguishing what he sees in the ruins of the Warsaw Ghetto when he visits in 1949 and what he himself has experienced as an African American. So for Du Bois, these forms of anti-Semitism and racism are neither identical, equal, nor are they separate and unique. They're in some sort of complicated relationality. And I think you see things like that in a figure like Fanon and in Arendt as well. I use these thinkers as well as various other ones from really across the post-war period, writers, artists, political activists, and political thinkers, to rethink the way we think about memory in general and about Holocaust memory in particular. Even when memories are in conflict with each other, they don't obey the logic of the zero-sum game. This competitive logic which assumes that if we have too much Holocaust memory, that means we can't also remember colonialism, or we can't also remember slavery. Or inversely, right, if we start to remember colonialism, that doesn't have to threaten the memory that we have of the Holocaust, right? Memory doesn't work in that model of scarcity, or at least this is my argument. It works productively, in fact. To me, this is the way that memory works. Memory works in this associative process in which one memory does not replace another, but rather echoes off of, borrows from, appropriates, if you want, in certain circumstances, and there's a kind of more of a spiraling relationship between memories than an exclusionary one. And I argue that, for example, if we want to understand the history of Holocaust memory, we now have to think about it in relationship to the history of memory, the history and memory of these other forms of violence. So you're inserting the Holocaust into these larger networks, and you're really kind of making it part of world history, which I think is what people like Arendt and Césaire and Du Bois were doing as well. So it kind of expands the scope, makes it relevant to larger audiences, and gets it beyond the like dissent-based groups where we often think it's located. We're talking about traumatic histories, which are intimately connected to people's sense of identity often, of course, and I'm not trying to contest that in any way. But what I try to contest in the book is an assumption that you have sort of preformed groups that have their own memories and that they possess these memories as a sort of exclusive property. So the Holocaust or Holocaust memory is the property in some sense of Jews and maybe Germans. The memory of slavery is the property in some sense of a group of people of the black diaspora, let's say African diaspora. Of course, we all have specific relationships to the kinds of violence that were perpetrated in our name or in our country of citizenship or whatever it is. That's absolutely true. But does that responsibility, this is the question for me, does that responsibility require us to think about the events themselves as unique and uncomparable? To me, it's a little baffling why one has to invest so much. And I'm also not saying that the Holocaust is not very particular and does not have all sorts of unique features to it. Of course it does. But even if it didn't, Germans would still be responsible for it, right? To go back to the slavery example, US slavery took very particular forms, but the US is not the only country that was built on slavery, but that doesn't minimize my responsibility for it in any way.
You're talking about how marginalized people or communities are allowed to find strength and power in sharing experiences or sharing, let's say, suffering, you know?
When there is too strong a sense of ownership over a particular memory or history, things can start to go wrong. It can start to be, that memory can start to be weaponized in various ways and can lead to the production of new victim groups, I suppose I would say. I do think when we sort of have that sort of possessive investment in our own particular memories, it does make it harder to imagine solidarity. And so for me, solidarity is primarily solidarity when it's a reaching out across the boundaries of identity.